News doesn't make money. People keep saying the problem with the news business is not the journalists, it's the business model. They're like, the advertisers are the problem. They don't care about corruption. It's all about the clicks. Or the subscription model is the problem. It's the paywalls. They're only for the rich. And the worst one is the audience is the problem. People are sick these days. They're messed up. We're just giving them what they want. So real reporting doesn't make money, but what if you still want it? We care about the little things, democracy, education, water. What if nonpartisan journalism was a philanthropic cause like you give to the YMCA or the Red Cross? If the audience is addicted to clickbait and doom scrolling, what if relevant information that affects your day-to-day life is the medicine? Stay tuned. Sarabeth, let's talk about this new model you're building for nonprofit local journalism. How does it work? Why is nonprofit better?
Thanks so much for having me. Our starting place is exactly where you just started with your little intro right there, which is that we really see this as a market failure. The rise of the internet led to a lot of disruption in a lot of industries. For many of those industries, that was totally fine for consumers. The decline of Blockbuster led to streaming, and that's been really good for consumers. But the decline of local news, of course, has been really terrible for our democracy and for the health of our communities. And as you know, and I think your listeners know, the data really backs that up. It is very clear that communities that have lost a local paper are in worse shape. We're seeing voter participation decline. We're seeing civic engagement decline. People are just less likely to get involved in their community because they don't know what's going on. We're seeing government waste increase because of the lack of accountability. And we're seeing the rise of polarization. People are far less likely to split their ticket in communities that have lost a local paper because what fills the void is the national press, social media, and it's literally nationalizing our local politics. So for all these reasons, we don't define this as just a disruption of an industry. We define this as a market failure. And this is really an essential public good that our democracy requires and that our society requires, which leads us to believe we have to figure out a new way to finance and sustain local news. And we're making a bet that the future of local news, of civic reporting, of providing the public service of reporting in communities is going to be largely funded through new models. And in our case, we're making a bet on nonprofit models, meaning organizations that are focused on the mission of their organization and not on delivering a market return. And organizations that are building diversified revenue to support the journalism. So when we say nonprofit, we don't mean non-commercial. We're not saying this entire thing is going to be funded through philanthropy, but we do think that philanthropy has a vital role to play over the long term, but specifically right now in this moment of crisis where thousands of communities don't have local papers, and even more communities have really shadows of their former self papers that are not providing the civic value that newspapers used to play. So the model that we're betting on are these nonprofit newsrooms that are supporting themselves through philanthropy, through reader revenue, through corporate sponsorships, and through other kind of creative ways to bring in revenue like events and really great swag.
But there's been so many over the past decades, there's been so many attempts to revive local news, save local news. What has been the problem with a lot of these attempts or on the for-profit side? There's been so many people try to get into it that have not been able to find scale. They haven't been able to figure it out.
I think that over the last decade and a half, as the local news industry that provided local news for us in the last century really sharply declined, we collectively tried to find a market solution. So we tried a lot of different models to try to solve the problem locally. Many papers, as we know, the national news organizations have been really successful in transforming themselves. The New York Times, the Washington Post. We all remember in 2008 when I think the New York Times had to take out a high interest loan from Carlos Slim. They were in trouble too, but they figured out how to weather it because of the market scale that the internet provides. But the fact of the matter is that local journalism is inherently not scalable. It's local. And so we need as many reporters covering our state houses and our city halls as we need in Washington. In fact, we arguably need more. 70%, more than 70% of our tax dollars are going to our local and state issues, not to our federal government. And yet we're swarming Washington with reporters.
What do you say to people who would say, yeah, but that's just because no one cares. No one wants to hear that. That's not going to get the clicks. That doesn't get the ratings. It's because no one cares.
I think people do care. And actually our research really does back that up. Like, we spend a lot of time doing market research, talking to people about what they want. And they actually do want local news. They want information about their communities. They want, quote, unbiased news. They want people to stop telling them what to think. That's exactly what they say in these interviews. The fact is that it's expensive. It is expensive to employ people to FOIA things, to dig in, to show up at these public meetings, to really follow stories and keep on those stories. It's expensive, but it's vital. So that's one issue. And then the other is, and I know not everyone likes it when we say this, but the fact is there are a lot of things that we need that we don't necessarily immediately want. If kids got to pick what subjects they had at school, they would do all gym and art. But we also know that it's important for kids to get strong education. And frankly, that's true of us as citizens, as the electorate. We need to have this information, not because you necessarily need it every day, but when you are heading to the ballot box, you want to know that the local news organization has been covering those news organizations, those candidates, so that you can quickly look up and say, okay, what is this candidate's record? And what have they been doing? And I may not be reading this every day because I may not be worried about it every day, but when I need it, I need it. And we need, as a society, to make sure that we're standing that up for people.
So how do you set that up? Is the payout of the 100 million fund, essentially, is that more like a VC fund with a strategic investment, or is it like a grant for certain projects?
Well, so the 100 million number that you're using, just to get specific, is both money that we've raised for a national pot that we're redispersing out to local news organizations, and money that we've directly raised for news organizations in markets. But for the national pot, we make strategic grants. So they are grants. We're not looking to get a financial return on our investment. We are looking to get an impact return on our investment, meaning we are measuring very closely the investments that we make. And the goal of the investments we make is to support the growth of these news organizations. So what I mean by that is we're making investments in their business infrastructure and their revenue infrastructure. And then we're tracking, did their revenue grow? Did their revenue diversify? Have these organizations become stronger, healthier, more financially sustainable? And we have lots of different mechanisms we use to measure that. And are they becoming, and we measure all of that to make sure that our investments are leading to organizations that are growing and are becoming healthier and can over time continue to grow so that they can frankly fill the void that has been left by the decline of commercial local news.
That's interesting. So it's actually your impact is also just creating resilient companies, as opposed to necessarily like how an impact investor would say, like, these are the people we affected, these are the people we helped, or that sort of thing.
Well, we measure that as well. But we think about it this way. Our goal is to build news organizations that are strong and resilient. Our news organizations' goals are to deliver impact on communities, meaning to serve readers, to serve communities, and to really provide the democratic value that we know local journalism provides. So we're tracking both the kind of impact that the journalism has, but our specific focus is on addressing the problem that you and I started this discussion with, which is how do we address the market failure, the business problem.
That's fascinating and very smart. That makes a lot of sense, and that's really great that that's your focus. Is how can you, or how do you, or maybe you could give an example of how you can see the impact, see more democratic, the strength of the democracy. How do you kind of measure those qualitative impacts?
Okay, so we're on the front end of this process right now, and the industry in general, I think, needs to be incredibly good at explaining the impact, because that is, frankly, the the revenue model. Like if you can demonstrate to readers and philanthropists and communities and civic businesses that may decide that they're going to sponsor your news organization out of a civic value and a sort of civic relationship, then you need to really be able to effectively demonstrate the value that you're having on communities. So we know very well, and we talked a little bit about this at the beginning of this conversation, the negative impacts that the decline of local news has had on communities, right? Like we know that voter participation declines, that civic engagement declines, that polarization increases, that government waste increases. What we need to be able to show over time is that the reverse happens. So we are working with several researchers to set up studies over the long term to be able to measure this. Nikki Usher, a really well-regarded communications scholar, just a couple of weeks ago published on Twitter a pre-peer review copy of her research. She put it out, as she said on Twitter, that she felt so good about the data, she wanted to put it out, and she felt like it was immediately actionable. But it basically began to answer this question, like, are there positive impacts from having nonprofit models? And what she found, I'm going to quote it, it said, findings suggest nonprofit interventions in failing local commercial markets may be an important safeguard for keeping public officials accountable. And then interestingly, she also found that the more philanthropic funding for local news in a community was positively associated with public corruption cases. So she was specifically looking at public corruption cases to see the correlation between the existence of nonprofit news and public corruption cases, with the assumption being that if you have good reporting, there will be more public corruption cases. So these are the kinds of studies that we need to have more broadly to show that the kind of positive impacts that local news is having. That said, individual newsrooms are having, just each one of them have so much really anecdotal but very clear stories of impact, moments where they did an investigation and it led to policy change or led to, better outcomes for communities, or readers donating and giving to the news organization because they see the value. We invested in a news organization in Puerto Rico called CPI, which did the investigation that led to the ousting of the governor there for his massive corruption. And readers swarmed them with philanthropic dollars when they did that because they saw the value. So we see the value in communities all the time. And we think it's really important, frankly, to raise awareness about the value of these organizations so that they can become more sustainable.
And raising $100 million for this type of thing is almost like sort of a new concept, because I think that's the most any organization has ever raised for this. Is this like, you sort of created like a little movement among philanthropists? Talk to me about how you make that pitch and how you create that kind of momentum.
Yeah, I mean, that is very much the goal. Like, we believe that philanthropy across this country really needs to lean in on local news, that it is foundational to all the other things they care about. And this is part of the case we make. Like, if you care about education, if you've been donating to education causes for a long, long time, then you need to be concerned about whether or not school boards are covered, charter school boards are covered, whether or not parents have the information they need to navigate the school system. I mean, that is an essential part of any investment in education, for instance. And that you can play that same story out, whether it's climate, whether it's health, whether it's equity issues. The information ecosystem is really essential. And so we're out there making the case to philanthropists about that. The truth is that philanthropy for a long time didn't need to give to local news. Of course, there was a long time where these newspapers were making mint and you didn't need philanthropy. So it's new. You need to go out and make the case to institutional philanthropy, to individuals. And what I will say is we are making progress. And the reason why we're making progress, I think, is a fewfold. One is the crisis is so acute. I mean, the truth is that now people see it. It's not just, 1,800 communities across this country literally have no idea what's going on in their communities. And even if you are in a place that has legacy papers, the fact is everyone reads it now. there was a study that came out that found that only 17% of most local papers are actually publishing local content, meaning what you're actually reading in your paper is national content and wire content and not local original reporting. So people are actually feeling it. I also think all this data that's coming out that's showing the correlation between the decline of local news and various other sort of insidious things that are happening throughout our democracy is really helping to make the case. And I think people are realizing we really need to reinvest in the basic infrastructure of our democracy, and local news is part of it.